Long before villages were built, before borders were drawn, and before shinobi wore headbands to signify allegiance, the world was defined by survival. Power was inherited through bloodlines, but peace was rare, fleeting, and fragile. It was in this distant era that the roots of the Senju clan first took hold, quietly, steadily, shaped not by conquest alone, but by an evolving philosophy of connection. The origin of the Senju clan can be traced back to the very beginning of chakra itself. In the age when chakra was first spread throughout the world, two brothers were born beneath the teachings of the Sage of Six Paths, Hagoromo Otsutsuki. One brother, Indra, inherited exceptional power, brilliance, and an instinct for domination. The other, Ashura, inherited something different. He was not born gifted. He struggled. He failed. But through cooperation, compassion, and perseverance, Ashura discovered strength through bonds. It was Ashura's path that would one day give rise to the Senju. While Indra's lineage valued individual power and supremacy, Ashura's descendants embraced unity, shared strength, and the belief that people grew stronger together. This philosophical divide would echo through generations, shaping not only clans, but the fate of the entire shinobi world. Ashura's followers gathered in small communities, bound not by fear, but by trust. They believed survival depended not on overwhelming force, but on cooperation. Families fighting side by side, clans supporting one another, and leaders rising through wisdom rather than raw power. These early groups were not yet called Senju, but their values laid the foundation for what the clan would become. Over time, Ashura's descendants developed remarkable vitality. They possessed strong life force, balanced chakra, and an unusual adaptability. Rather than specializing in a single technique or bloodline ability, they became proficient in many disciplines: taijutsu, ninjutsu, genjutsu, and healing. Their strength came from versatility, from endurance, and from the ability to fight on even when others fell. This adaptability earned them a name: Senju, meaning 1,000 hands. It was not a literal description, but a symbolic one. The Senju were said to possess 1,000 skills, 1,000 ways to respond to conflict, 1,000 methods to survive. Where other clans relied on a singular inherited power, the Senju cultivated balance. Where others clung to pride, the Senju emphasized responsibility. But the world they inhabited was unforgiving. As generations passed, competition for land and resources intensified. Clans were hired as mercenaries, fighting wars that had nothing to do with their own grievances. Children grew up on battlefields. Survival demanded strength, and even clans built on ideals of unity were forced to adapt to endless violence. The Senju did not seek war, but they became formidable within it. Their warriors were known for their stamina and resilience. They could endure prolonged battles, adapt to enemy tactics, and support one another through coordination rather than overwhelming power. Their leaders emphasized teamwork, ensuring that no shinobi fought alone. Victory, to the Senju, was not measured by enemies slain, but by comrades brought home alive. Still, conflict carved scars deep into their history. Opposing them through many generations was another clan born from the sages' lineage, the Uchiha. While the Senju valued unity, the Uchiha refined power through emotion and intensity. Their clashes became legendary, not because one side was inherently evil, but because both represented opposing philosophies of strength. The battlefield became the meeting ground of two ancient ideals. For the Senju, war was a necessary evil. For the Uchiha, it was a crucible of power. Their encounters shaped legends, hardened warriors, and deepened resentment. Children born into both clans inherited not only techniques, but grudges passed down like heirlooms. And yet, even amid endless bloodshed, the Senju dream of peace endured. Unlike many clans who embraced conflict as destiny, the Senju believed the cycle could be broken. Elders spoke of a future where children would no longer be sent to war, where clans would live together under shared rules rather than endless vendettas. These ideas were fragile, often dismissed as unrealistic, but they survived. Whispered around campfires, taught quietly to the next generation. The Senju did not lack strength. What they lacked was a world ready to accept peace. As the years passed, the clan grew in number and influence. Their territories expanded, their alliances multiplied, and their reputation solidified. They became known not just as warriors, but as protectors, called upon to defend villages, escort civilians, and stabilize regions torn apart by conflict. But their greatest trials were still to come. From within the Senju would be born leaders whose names would reshape history. Figures who would carry Ashura's ideals further than anyone before them. Figures who would dare to imagine a world without clan wars, even when surrounded by generations of hatred. The seeds of that transformation were already planted. They rested within the Senju belief that power meant nothing if it could not protect others. That leadership was not dominance, but responsibility. That peace was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. And as the world edged closer to its most violent era, the Senju clan stood at the center of change, unaware that their next generation would redefine what it meant to be a shinobi. Because soon, a child would be born among them, whose name would become synonymous with peace itself. And with him, the Senju clan would step into destiny. As the world moved deeper into the age, later known as the Warring States era, the ideals of the Senju clan were tested relentlessly. What had once been small-scale conflicts between wandering clans evolved into prolonged wars fought for territory, influence, and survival. The land itself seemed shaped by violence, with forests burned, rivers stained by blood, and villages rising only to be destroyed again. For the Senju, war was not a path chosen willingly, but one forced upon them by the nature of the world they inhabited. Children were raised with the understanding that survival required strength. From an early age, they trained not just in combat, but in awareness, coordination, and endurance. Senju children learned to fight alongside one another, to read the battlefield as a shared space rather than a personal arena. Their elders taught them that lone heroes fell quickly, while united groups endured. This philosophy made the Senju uniquely resilient. They did not rely on secret techniques passed down through a single bloodline ability. Instead, they cultivated adaptability. One Senju might specialize in fire or water, another in earth or wind, another in medical techniques or sensory perception. Together, they formed balanced units capable of responding to almost any threat. Their greatest rivals during this era were the Uchiha. Where the Senju emphasized cooperation, the Uchiha refined power through emotional intensity. Their Sharingan allowed them to read movements, copy techniques, and strike with terrifying precision. Battles between the two clans became infamous, not only for their scale, but for their brutality. Neither side could afford mercy. Victory often came at the cost of children who never reached adulthood. The battlefield did not distinguish between innocence and experience. The Senju lost countless sons and daughters during this time. Entire families were erased before they could fully form. And yet, even as grief hollowed their hearts, the clan refused to surrender its core belief. Each loss reinforced the desire to end the cycle, not through domination, but through peace. Among the Senju, leaders began emerging whose names would be remembered long after the era itself faded. One such figure was Butsuma Senju, a formidable warrior, and the patriarch of one of the clan's most influential families. Butsuma was hardened by war, shaped by loss, and fiercely protective of his people. He understood the necessity of strength, yet carried a quiet awareness of the cost it demanded. Under his leadership, the Senju refined their tactics, improving coordination and defensive strategies that minimized casualties whenever possible. Butsuma had children of his own, sons who would grow up in the shadow of endless war. From a young age, these children were exposed to the harsh realities of the world. They trained with wooden weapons before their hands could fully grasp them. They learned battlefield signals before they learned games. Laughter existed, but it was fleeting, fragile, always threatened by the looming presence of conflict. Still, something remarkable persisted. Despite everything, the Senju children formed bonds of extraordinary depth. They protected one another instinctively. Older siblings watched over younger ones. Teams were built not just on skill, but on trust. In a world where betrayal was common, the Senju clung fiercely to loyalty within their ranks. Across the battlefield, the Uchiha mirrored them in many ways. They, too, lost children. They, too, trained relentlessly. But where the Senju sought unity, the Uchiha often turned inward, strengthening individual prowess. Their pain sharpened their power, but it also isolated them. The gulf between the two clans widened, not only through violence, but through philosophy. Each clash reinforced the idea that peace was impossible. And yet, quietly, beneath the roar of battle, something began to change. Among the Senju children, one stood out, not because he was the strongest, but because he questioned the world around him. He watched his siblings train, watched his comrades fall, and wondered if there was another way. He listened when elders spoke of Ashura's teachings, of cooperation and shared strength, and felt those words resonate deeply within him. This child was Hashirama Senju. From an early age, Hashirama possessed remarkable vitality. His chakra was abundant, his endurance exceptional, and his presence calming. But more important than his physical gifts was his heart. Hashirama grieved deeply for every life lost, friend or foe. He struggled to accept the inevitability of war, questioning why children were forced to fight battles born from ancient grudges. He was not alone. Across enemy lines, another child wrestled with similar questions. Madara Uchiha. Though born into opposing clans, the two shared an uncanny similarity in spirit. Both were shaped by loss. Both yearned for strength. And both carried dreams larger than the battlefield they were forced to inhabit. Fate brought them together in secret. Meeting by chance near a riverbank, Hashirama and Madara spoke not as enemies, but as children exhausted by war. They shared stories of fallen brothers, of fathers hardened by grief, of a world that demanded violence before understanding. In those quiet moments, the ancient feud between Senju and Uchiha faded into the background. They dreamed together, a world without clan wars, a world where children could grow old, a world where strength existed to protect, not destroy. Their friendship became a fragile sanctuary, one that could not survive the reality of their lineage. When their identities were eventually revealed, the weight of expectation crashed down upon them. Their clans demanded loyalty. Their fathers demanded obedience. The battlefield reclaimed them, forcing them back into roles they had never chosen. Yet the dream did not disappear. Within Hashirama, the dream took root like a seed planted deep within fertile soil. Even as he fought, even as he lost siblings to the endless violence, he carried the belief that peace was not a fantasy. It was a responsibility. The Senju watched him grow stronger, wiser, more compassionate. They saw in him not just a warrior, but a leader whose strength came from understanding rather than dominance. His presence on the battlefield inspired those around him, not through fear, but through trust. As the Warring States era reached its bloodiest height, the Senju clan stood at a crossroads. They could continue fighting until only one clan remained standing. Or they could dare to imagine something unprecedented. And at the center of that decision stood Hashirama Senju, carrying Ashura's will more fully than any descendant before him. The stage was set for a turning point that would reshape the world forever. As the warring states era deepened, the dream Hashirama carried grew heavier with each passing year. Battles became more frequent. Missions lasted longer. The faces of fallen comrades lingered in memory long after the fighting ceased. For the Senju, survival demanded constant vigilance, but for Hashirama, survival without peace felt increasingly hollow. Hashirama matured rapidly, shaped by both responsibility and loss. His strength grew extraordinary, his chakra reserves vast, his stamina unmatched, and his ability to recover from injury bordering on miraculous. Yet unlike many warriors of his era, Hashirama never sought recognition through dominance. He fought to protect his people, but he mourned every life taken, even those of his enemies. His younger brother, Tobirama Senju, stood beside him through these trials. Where Hashirama was guided by compassion, Tobirama was guided by clarity and pragmatism. He observed the world without illusion, recognizing patterns of betrayal and ambition that others overlooked. Tobirama understood the brutality of the era and believed peace, if achieved, would require strict structure and vigilance. His intellect was sharp, his tactical thinking precise, and his trust carefully measured. Together, the brothers formed a balance within the Senju. Hashirama inspired through hope. Tobirama protected through caution. Their bond strengthened the clan, ensuring that ideals did not blind them to danger, and that realism did not extinguish their humanity. The rivalry with the Uchiha continued to escalate. Each clash between the two clans resulted in devastating losses on both sides. Children who had once trained together were buried beneath the same soil they fought upon, and still the cycle repeated. During this time, Hashirama's encounters with Madara resumed, not as friends, but as warriors standing on opposite sides of history. Each time they crossed blades, their shared past lingered beneath the violence, creating a tension that neither could ignore. They recognized one another as equals, not only in strength, but in vision. Yet their visions had begun to diverge. Madara, hardened by repeated loss, grew increasingly convinced that peace could only be achieved through overwhelming power. He believed fear was the only language the world understood. Hashirama, though equally scarred, clung to the belief that peace built on fear would inevitably collapse. He envisioned a world governed by cooperation, trust, and shared responsibility. The battlefield became the arena where these philosophies collided. Hashirama's power began to manifest in unprecedented ways. His mastery over wood-style techniques, mokuton, set him apart from all others. Trees surged from barren ground at his command, creating barriers, weapons, and sanctuaries in the midst of chaos. His techniques were not only destructive, but restorative, capable of reshaping the battlefield itself. The Senju saw mokuton as more than a weapon. It symbolized life emerging from devastation. It reflected Hashirama's inner desire to cultivate peace where only ruin existed. Under Hashirama's leadership, the Senju adopted increasingly defensive strategies. They sought to protect territory, evacuate civilians, and minimize unnecessary bloodshed. Though still formidable in combat, their focus began shifting from conquest to preservation. Tobirama supported these efforts by refining battlefield coordination. He developed techniques that enhanced communication, mobility, and reconnaissance. His innovations allowed Senju forces to respond rapidly to threats, reducing casualties and increasing efficiency. Where Hashirama shaped ideals, Tobirama shaped systems. But even as the Senju refined their approach, the world resisted change. Clan leaders across the land dismissed peace as weakness. Alliances dissolved under pressure. Betrayals were commonplace. Every attempt to step away from war was met with suspicion. Hashirama felt the weight of this resistance deeply. He questioned whether his dream was truly possible or whether the world was simply not ready. Madara, witnessing the same resistance, drew different conclusions. He embraced power. As the Sharingan within him evolved, Madara grew more formidable. His presence on the battlefield became overwhelming, his techniques devastating. He believed that only by becoming an unassailable force could he impose peace upon the world. In his eyes, compassion without control was doomed to fail. The final confrontation between Hashirama and Madara loomed ever closer. Their respective clans pushed them forward as champions, symbols of their philosophies and their future. Each battle between them grew more intense, more personal, more destructive. And yet, neither could bring themselves to strike the final blow. They understood each other too well. In one decisive clash, their powers reshaped the land itself. Trees splintered, the earth cracked, the air trembled beneath the weight of their chakra. And when the battle ended, both stood exhausted, injured, and filled with the knowledge that continuing down this path would lead only to mutual annihilation. It was in this moment of clarity that Hashirama made a choice. He extended an offer of peace, not as a conqueror, not as a victor, but as someone willing to shoulder the burden of compromise. He proposed the unthinkable, an alliance between Senju and Uchiha, a shared settlement, a system where clans would no longer fight endlessly, but coexist under mutual protection. It was a dream bold enough to terrify both sides. Madara hesitated. The weight of his clan's losses pressed heavily upon him. Trust felt like betrayal. Vulnerability felt dangerous. And yet, deep within him, the memory of their childhood dream stirred. For the first time in generations, the cycle wavered. Though resistance arose from both clans, especially from those who had lost too much to forgive, the idea could not be erased. The younger generation, weary of endless war, began to listen. The elders, though cautious, recognized that the cost of continuing was extinction. Slowly, painfully, the world shifted. The Senju and Uchiha laid down arms. The Warring States era drew to a close, not through victory, but through agreement. And on the land where countless battles had been fought, a new settlement began to take shape. A village built not on bloodshed, but on hope. This village would come to be known as Konohagakure, the hidden leaf. And with its founding, the Senju Clan would step into a role that would define the future of the shinobi world forever. The end of the Warring States era did not arrive with celebration or triumph. It arrived quietly, cautiously, like the first calm morning after a long and unforgiving storm. The battlefield that had once echoed with clashing steel and desperate cries now stood silent, marked by scars that told the story of generations lost. Upon this land, the Senju and Uchiha began something unprecedented. Not merely a ceasefire, but the construction of a shared future. The founding of Konohagakure was slow and uncertain. Former enemies worked side by side, clearing land, building homes, and laying down the first paths that would become village streets. Suspicion lingered in every interaction. Old wounds had not yet healed. Many shinobi kept their weapons close, unsure if peace would truly last. Yet beneath the tension, there was something unfamiliar but hopeful, a shared exhaustion with war. For the Senju, this moment represented the fulfillment of Ashura's ancient ideal. They approached the village not as conquerors, but as caretakers. Their strength, once honed for survival, was now redirected toward construction, protection, and organization. Senju shinobi patrolled the borders not to expand territory, but to shield the fragile peace forming within. They assisted families in rebuilding, trained younger generations, and worked to ensure that no single clan held unchecked power. At the center of this effort stood Hashirama Senju. Though widely recognized as the strongest among them, Hashirama did not seek authority for its own sake. He listened more than he commanded. He mediated disputes between clans, softened resentments through sincerity, and reminded everyone that the village existed to prevent children from dying as they had. His presence brought a sense of stability that words alone could not. The Uchiha, though cautious, recognized his sincerity. Madara, however, struggled. Though he had agreed to the alliance, doubt followed him like a shadow. He watched as Hashirama's influence grew, as the Senju's philosophy subtly shaped the village's foundation. Madara feared that the Uchiha would one day be marginalized, not through violence, but through trust, misplaced in a system that favored cooperation over power. This tension came to a head with the creation of the Hokage system. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary. A single leader would govern the village, chosen not by lineage, but by ability and trust. This leader would act as protector, mediator, and symbol of unity. For the Senju, this system reflected everything they believed in: leadership rooted in responsibility rather than domination. Hashirama was the obvious choice. The clans, weary of war and inspired by his vision, chose him unanimously. He became the first Hokage, not through conquest, but through consensus. His appointment marked a fundamental shift in shinobi culture. Power was no longer inherited solely by blood or seized by force. It was entrusted. For the Senju Clan, this was both an honor and a burden. They now carried the responsibility of guiding not just themselves, but an entire village composed of former rivals. Tobirama Senju, ever pragmatic, immediately set about strengthening the village's infrastructure. He understood that peace without systems would collapse under its own weight. Tobirama helped establish formal institutions. Training academies were designed to educate children from all clans together, fostering bonds before resentment could take root. Mission distribution systems were created to ensure fairness and prevent favoritism. Rules were written, clear, enforceable, and consistent, to replace the chaos of clan warfare with order. Yet not everyone welcomed these changes. Madara's distrust deepened as he observed Tobirama's influence. He interpreted the new systems as mechanisms of control, believing the Uchiha were being subtly restrained while the Senju consolidated authority. The dream he and Hashirama once shared now seemed to him compromised by political reality. Hashirama sensed this fracture. He reached out repeatedly, attempting to reassure Madara, reminding him of their shared vision. He believed trust could still mend the widening gap. But Madara, shaped by too much loss, could no longer place his faith in ideals alone. Their final confrontation was inevitable. At the Valley of the End, the two founders clashed one last time, not merely as warriors, but as embodiments of opposing beliefs. Hashirama fought to preserve unity. Madara fought to enforce order through power. Their battle reshaped the land, their chakra colliding with such force that the terrain itself bore witness to their conflict. In the end, Hashirama emerged victorious. But there was no celebration in his victory. Madara fell into the depths below, presumed dead. And with him went the last remnant of their childhood dream, as it once was. Hashirama mourned deeply, not only for his friend, but for the understanding that peace would always require sacrifice. The village endured. Konohagakure continued to grow, slowly transforming from an experiment into a thriving settlement. More clans joined. Inuzuka, Nara, Akimichi, Hyuga, each bringing their traditions, strengths, and concerns. The Senju worked tirelessly to ensure these clans were integrated fairly, reinforcing the village's foundation of shared responsibility. Hashirama ruled with humility. He resolved disputes through dialogue, distributed power rather than hoarding it, and remained approachable to even the lowest-ranking shinobi. His leadership style became a template, one that future Hokage would study, admire, and struggle to live up to. Yet the burden of peace weighed heavily on him. Hashirama understood that peace was not a permanent state, but a continuous effort. He feared what would happen after he was gone. He worried whether the systems Tobirama built would be enough to prevent future conflict. He worried whether the Senju ideal would endure in a world still haunted by ancient grudges. Still, he pressed forward. Under his guidance, the Senju Clan shifted fully into their new role, not merely warriors, but architects of stability. Their adaptability, once a battlefield advantage, became a governing strength. They mediated, protected, and nurtured the next generation. The age of clans at war had ended. The age of villages had begun. And at the heart of it all, the Senju Clan stood as both foundation and guardian, unaware that their greatest challenges and their greatest sacrifices still lay ahead. As Konohagakure settled into its early years, the Senju Clan found itself standing at the peak of its influence, not through domination, but through responsibility. The village was no longer an experiment born from desperation. It was becoming a living system, one that required constant care, discipline, and foresight to survive in a world still shaped by mistrust. Hashirama Senju carried this responsibility with quiet determination. As first Hokage, he dedicated himself to the belief that peace must be actively protected, not passively hoped for. He met with leaders of neighboring lands, negotiated treaties, and worked tirelessly to convince others that the era of clan warfare had truly ended. His charisma and sincerity softened even the most hardened skeptics. Many who met him left with the sense that the world had, at last, taken a step in the right direction. But peace, though genuine, remained fragile. The great nations watched one another carefully. Old rivalries had not vanished. They had merely been paused. Smaller villages struggled to adapt to the new order, uncertain how to survive without mercenary contracts. Hashirama understood this imbalance and sought ways to stabilize the world beyond Konoha's borders. It was during this time that the tailed beasts became central to the future of shinobi politics. Hashirama, possessing overwhelming strength and unparalleled sealing capabilities, captured several of these creatures, not to weaponize them for conquest, but to prevent any one nation from gaining absolute dominance. His intent was balance. He distributed the tailed beasts among the major villages, believing shared power would discourage war. To Hashirama, this was an act of peace. To others, it was a reminder that power still ruled the world. While Hashirama focused outward, Tobirama Senju turned his attention inward, toward the systems that would keep the village stable long after their founders were gone. Tobirama understood something his brother struggled with. Ideals alone could not protect a village. They needed structure. They needed rules strong enough to withstand fear, ambition, and betrayal. Tobirama expanded the institutions he had begun shaping during Konoha's founding. The Ninja Academy became formalized, standardizing education so children from every clan learned together from a young age. This was not just training. It was cultural integration. Tobirama believed that bonds formed in childhood would weaken clan-based resentment over time. He also established the mission ranking system, ensuring shinobi were assigned tasks appropriate to their abilities. This reduced unnecessary casualties and prevented exploitation. It was a calculated approach to preserving life, one born from Tobirama's understanding of how quickly chaos could return. Yet Tobirama's most controversial decision involved the Uchiha. Following Madara's departure and presumed death, trust between the Uchiha and the village leadership remained strained. Tobirama, wary of the Sharingan's potential and the emotional volatility that accompanied it, believed oversight was necessary. He proposed placing the Uchiha in charge of Konoha's military police force. To Tobirama, this was a pragmatic solution. It gave the Uchiha authority and responsibility within the village. It allowed them to channel their strength toward maintaining order. And it created a clear boundary between governance and enforcement. But perception mattered. To many Uchiha, this decision felt isolating, placing them at the village's edge rather than its center. While Hashirama hoped trust would mend these divisions naturally, Tobirama believed boundaries were essential for long-term stability. Their differing approaches did not fracture the Senju, but they highlighted a tension that would echo into the future. Despite these challenges, the Senju Clan thrived. They continued producing exceptional shinobi, not defined by a singular Kekki Genkai, but by balance and resilience. Senju techniques ranged across elemental mastery, medical ninjutsu, and barrier creation. Their adaptability made them natural leaders, strategists, and mentors within the village. But even at their height, the Senju did not escape loss. Hashirama's health began to decline quietly. Though he remained powerful, his regenerative abilities, once seemingly limitless, showed subtle signs of strain. The years of constant conflict, the burden of leadership, and the toll of his own chakra took their price. Hashirama rarely spoke of it, but Tobirama noticed. He watched his brother push himself relentlessly, refusing to rest while the world remained uncertain. When Hashirama eventually passed, the village mourned deeply. His death was not marked by a single battle or dramatic sacrifice, but by the slow extinguishing of a guiding light. He left behind a legacy unmatched, peace forged from chaos, a village built on trust, and a system designed to outlast him. Tobirama Senju became the second Hokage. Where Hashirama had led with warmth, Tobirama led with precision. His tenure marked a shift from idealism to reinforcement. He strengthened Konoha's defenses, expanded intelligence networks, and prepared the village for threats he believed were inevitable. He did not assume peace would last. He prepared for its failure. Under Tobirama's rule, the Senju continued shaping the village's future. He formalized the ANBU, established the Chunin exams as a means of measuring skill and leadership, and refined the use of space-time and forbidden techniques, always with caution, always with control. His inventions were not meant to glorify power, but to ensure survival. Yet Tobirama was not without flaws. His distrust of the Uchiha hardened over time, shaped by Madara's legacy and his fear of internal collapse. Though his intentions were rooted in protection, they contributed to a growing divide that would later prove catastrophic. The Senju Clan stood firmly at the village's core during this era, guiding Konoha through a period of cautious growth. Their influence extended through policy, education, and defense. They were not conquerors, but architects, shaping a world that demanded constant vigilance. But even Tobirama understood that his role was temporary. He trained the next generation with care, selecting students not just for strength, but for character. Among them was Hiruzen Sarutobi, a shinobi whose balance of intellect, compassion, and discipline reflected the very ideals the Senju had spent generations cultivating. As the world edged toward new conflicts beyond Konoha's borders, Tobirama prepared for the inevitable. He knew that leadership required sacrifice. And when the moment came, when enemy forces threatened the village and retreat was the only option, Tobirama made his final decision. He appointed Hiruzen as the third Hokage and sacrificed himself to ensure his students' survival. In that moment, Tobirama embodied the Senju ideal completely. Strength used not for domination, but for protection. Power surrendered so others could live. With his passing, the Senju clan entered a new phase, no longer solely defined by leadership, but by legacy. The age of founders had ended, and the consequences of their choices were about to ripple through history. With the passing of Tobirama Senju, an era quietly came to an end. The founders were gone. The brothers who had carried the weight of an entire generation, who had turned a dream into a living village, now existed only in memory, policy, and the deeply embedded structure of Konohagakure itself. The Senju clan did not vanish overnight, but from this point forward, their presence began to change. Hiruzen Sarutobi ascended as the third Hokage during a time of uncertainty. The first great ninja war loomed large over the shinobi world, drawing villages into conflict not driven by ancient grudges, but by political tension and fear of imbalance. Unlike Hashirama and Tobirama, Hiruzen did not inherit a village being born. He inherited one being tested. Though not a Senju by blood, Hiruzen was shaped by their teachings. He carried Hashirama's belief in understanding and Tobirama's respect for structure. His leadership reflected a careful balance of compassion and pragmatism, an attempt to honor both brothers without repeating their mistakes. Under his guidance, Konoha endured its first true trial as a unified village rather than a coalition of clans. The Senju clan supported him quietly. They no longer stood as the face of leadership, but their influence ran deep. Senju shinobi served as commanders, medics, instructors, and advisors. Their adaptability made them invaluable in a war that demanded versatility rather than brute force. Where other clans relied on specialized abilities, the Senju filled gaps, reinforced defenses, and stabilized battlefields. Yet war extracts a cost that no ideal can fully protect against. The first great ninja war claimed countless lives, including many Senju. those who had grown up believing they would never fight again, found themselves on the front lines, defending the village their ancestors had built. The war did not discriminate between clans. It consumed experience, talent, and hope equally. When the war finally ended, the world had changed. Villages emerged stronger, but more cautious. Alliances were forged not from trust, but necessity. Konoha survived, but at a price. The Senju clan, once vast and influential, found its numbers diminished. Their identity began to blur as survivors intermarried with other clans, choosing unity over preservation of lineage. This was not a failure. It was a fulfillment of their philosophy. The Senju had always believed in the village above the clan, where the Uchiha struggled to maintain identity within Konoha. The Senju dissolved naturally into it. Their bloodline spread quietly, diluted not by weakness, but by choice. In time, it became difficult to identify a pure Senju household. Their legacy became cultural rather than genetic. The will of fire, once a teaching shared between Hashirama and Tobirama, became the village's guiding principle. The idea that shinobi exist to protect the next generation, even at the cost of their own lives, shaped Konoha's response to every threat that followed. As decades passed, the Senju name faded from daily conversation, not because they were forgotten, but because they were everywhere. Their influence lived on through institutions, traditions, and values. The academy still taught unity. The Hokage system still symbolized entrusted power. The village still prioritized collective survival over individual ambition. These were Senju ideals, quietly upheld. Tsunade Senju, however, carried the name forward. As Hashirama's granddaughter, she embodied both the promise and the burden of the clan's legacy. From a young age, her talent was undeniable. Her medical aptitude surpassed her peers, and her chakra control hinted at potential rivaling her grandfather's. But Tsunade's life would be shaped by loss. The deaths of her brother Nawaki and her lover Dan during the Second Great Ninja War shattered her belief in the ideals she had been raised on. The will of fire, once comforting, became painful. The village she had sworn to protect now felt like a machine that consumed those she loved. She turned away. Tsunade left Konoha, abandoning not only her role as a shinobi, but her identity as a Senju. She wandered the world, numbing herself through gambling and detachment, haunted by memories she could not reconcile with the promises of peace. Her departure symbolized the emotional cost of the Senju legacy. They had built a world where sacrifice was normalized, even expected. And while that world endured, it left scars on those who carried its ideals most deeply. Back in Konoha, Hiruzen continued to lead. The village grew more complex, more entangled in global politics. New threats emerged: rogue ninja, espionage, internal dissent. The shadow of the Uchiha loomed larger, their isolation intensifying under policies originally meant to maintain order. The Senju, no longer a distinct political force, could not intervene directly. Their role had transformed from leadership to stewardship. They influenced through mentorship rather than authority, through example rather than decree. As the Third Great Ninja War erupted, Konoha once again found itself on the brink. Young shinobi were sent to battlefields their predecessors had hoped would never exist again. Heroes rose, Minato Namikaze among them, shaped by the very systems the Senju had created. The cycle continued, but so did the village. Minato's leadership, though brief, echoed Hashirama's spirit. He fought not for glory, but for protection. His selflessness during the Nine Tails attack would later define a new era, tying the Senju legacy to a child who did not bear their name, but embodied their will completely. Naruto Uzumaki was born into that moment. Though his story had not yet begun in full, his fate was already intertwined with the Senju ideal. The village he would grow up in, the bonds he would struggle to form, the belief that perseverance could overcome hatred, all traced back to the choices made by the Senju Clan generations earlier. By the time Hiruzen reclaimed the mantle of Hokage, the Senju were no longer visible as a clan, but they had succeeded in their truest goal. They had created a world where clans mattered less than people, where the village endured beyond bloodlines, where the future belonged not to those born powerful, but to those willing to protect others. And in that world, the Senju lived on. As the years passed, Konohagakure continued to expand, not only in size, but in complexity. The village founded to end an age of endless war now faced challenges far removed from the battlefield conflicts of its origin. Political tension, internal distrust, and unseen threats replaced open warfare. In this evolving world, the Senju clan had almost completely faded from public view. Yet their influence remained deeply embedded in every system, every value, and every decision the village made. The absence of the Senju as a visible clan did not mean their ideals had vanished. Rather, they had become so ingrained in the village's identity that they were no longer recognized as belonging to any single lineage. The will of fire was no longer spoken of as a Senju belief. It was simply the way Konoha understood itself. Protect the village. Protect the next generation. End the cycle of hatred, even if it required sacrifice. But ideals, when left without balance, can harden. The policies Tobirama Senju had established, designed to preserve stability, remained in place long after his death. Over time, without the guiding presence of Hashirama's empathy, those systems grew rigid. Nowhere was this more evident than in the growing isolation of the Uchiha clan. Once co-founders of the village, the Uchiha had slowly been pushed to the margins. Assigned authority without trust, responsibility without representation, they became separated from the heart of Konoha's leadership. What had once been a pragmatic solution evolved into a quiet division, one that bred resentment and suspicion on both sides. The Senju, had they still existed as a unified political force, might have mediated this fracture, but they were gone, not defeated, not erased, but dissolved into the village itself. And so, the structures they left behind continued without their guiding hand. The night of the Uchiha massacre shattered the illusion of unity. Though executed in secrecy and justified as a measure to prevent civil war, it marked a profound moral rupture. A clan was erased in the name of stability. Children were sacrificed for peace. The village survived, but something essential was lost. This moment stood in stark contrast to the Senju vision. Hashirama had dreamed of a village where children would never again bear the weight of their ancestors' conflicts. Yet here was proof that even the strongest ideals could be compromised when fear replaced dialogue. In the aftermath, Konohagakure entered a period of quiet guilt. Trust fractured. Silence replaced transparency. The will of fire endured, but it was strained, tested by decisions that contradicted its original purpose. And as these events unfolded, the last living Senju of true prominence remained far from the village. Tsunade Senju had turned her back on Konoha long before the massacre. Her departure was not born of selfishness, but grief. The deaths of her younger brother Nawaki and her lover Dan during the Second Great Ninja War had shattered her faith in the ideals she had been raised to believe in. The village that preached sacrifice had taken everything from her. To Tsunade, the will of fire became a cruel promise, one that demanded endless loss without offering peace in return. She wandered from place to place, numbing herself through gambling and detachment. Though her medical brilliance remained unmatched, she refused to use it for a system she no longer trusted. The Senju legacy, once a source of pride, became something she could not bear to carry. But destiny, shaped by ideals older than any individual, does not easily release its heirs. When Hiruzen Sarutobi fell defending the village during the invasion of Konoha, the need for leadership became urgent. The village stood vulnerable once more, its systems intact, but its spirit shaken. In this moment of crisis, attention turned to Tsunade. Her return was reluctant. She did not come back to reclaim honor or authority. She returned because the village needed her, and because she was confronted by a boy who embodied everything she had lost faith in. Naruto Uzumaki changed Tsunade in ways no argument ever could. His refusal to abandon hope, despite being shunned and burdened with the Nine Tails, mirrored Hashirama's unwavering belief in people. Naruto did not deny pain. He acknowledged it, carried it, and still chose connection over resentment. In Naruto, Tsunade saw her grandfather's dream reborn. She saw a child who believed the village could be better, not because it was perfect, but because people were worth saving. And for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to believe again. Tsunade accepted the role of fifth Hokage. With her ascension, the Senju Clan returned to leadership, not as founders or architects, but as guardians of life. Tsunade reshaped Konoha's priorities, placing medical ninjutsu at the center of its military doctrine. Her insistence that no shinobi should die unnecessarily transformed battlefield strategy across the village. Under her rule, survival became as important as victory. Tsunade ruled with strength born of experience, not idealism alone. She understood loss intimately and refused to glorify it. Her leadership was defined by resilience, the ability to endure pain without surrendering compassion. The Senju legacy evolved once more. It was no longer defined by overwhelming power, as it had been under Hashirama. It was no longer defined by strict systems, as it had been under Tobirama. It was now defined by endurance, the ability to continue believing, even after everything had been taken away. As Tsunade led the village through a new age of threats, Naruto continued to grow. Though not a Senju by blood, Naruto carried their philosophy more purely than anyone since the village's founding. Every bond he formed, every enemy he sought to understand rather than destroy, echoed the ideals the Senju had spent generations cultivating. By the time whispers of Akatsuki grew into global concern, the Senju Clan existed only as a name in history. But their purpose had not ended. It had simply found its final expression. And that expression was moving steadily toward a conflict that would decide whether the dream of the Senju could survive in a world still bound by hatred. The approach of the Fourth Great Ninja War did not announce itself with a single defining moment. Instead, it crept into the world quietly, carried by unease, fractured alliances, and the slow realization that the fragile peace the Senju had worked so hard to build was never as secure as it seemed. Beneath decades of relative calm, old wounds remained open, merely hidden beneath routine and habit. Akatsuki became the symbol of this unresolved tension. What had once been framed as a pursuit of peace through shared suffering evolved into something far more dangerous. Their systematic hunt for the tailed beasts threatened to unravel the balance Hashirama Senju had tried to establish generations earlier. Each capture disrupted the equilibrium between nations, reminding the world that power, when centralized, inevitably bred fear. For Tsunade Senju, the signs were unmistakable. She understood that this conflict would not resemble the wars of the past. This would not be a struggle over land or influence, but over ideology itself. The very question that had defined the Senju since the Warring States era was returning with renewed urgency. Could peace truly be achieved without domination? Tsunade prepared Konoha with quiet resolve. Rather than rallying the village through speeches or displays of strength, she focused on preparation. Medical divisions were expanded and refined. Emergency response systems were reinforced. Shinobi were trained not only to fight, but to survive and support one another under extreme conditions. For Tsunade, preserving life was not secondary to victory. It was the victory. Her approach reflected the final evolution of the Senju legacy, where Hashirama had dreamed of unity and Tobirama had enforced stability. Tsunade embraced endurance. She knew that ideals could not prevent suffering entirely, but they could shape how that suffering was confronted. As tensions escalated, the impossible occurred. Villages that had once stood as bitter enemies gathered together under a single banner. The allied shinobi forces formed not out of trust, but necessity. It was the first time in history that the world came close to embodying Hashirama's vision on a global scale. Yet, unity born from fear carried its own fragility. Old rivalries lingered beneath forced cooperation. Generals eyed one another cautiously. Shinobi fought alongside former enemies, while memories of past wars remained vivid. The alliance was real, but so was the doubt holding it together. At the center of this unstable coalition stood Naruto Uzumaki. Once ignored, feared, and dismissed, Naruto had become a figure the world could not overlook. He carried within him the power Akatsuki sought, yet he wielded it differently than anyone before him. The Nine Tails was no longer a curse he resented. It was a burden he chose to understand. Naruto's training forced him to confront hatred directly. He faced not only the malice directed at him by others, but the resentment that had quietly grown within himself. Instead of rejecting it, he acknowledged it. In doing so, he followed the same path Hashirama had once walked, believing that understanding was stronger than suppression. Tsunade observed this transformation closely. In Naruto, she saw the answer to a question that had haunted the Senju legacy for generations. Power did not have to corrupt. Strength did not require domination. Naruto proved that empathy could exist even at the highest levels of power. When the war finally began, it spread across the world like a slow-burning fire. Battlefields stretched across distant lands, drawing shinobi of every nation into prolonged conflict. For many, this was their first true war. For others, it reopened wounds they had never fully healed from. The scale of the conflict dwarfed anything the modern world had experienced. And yet, something was different. This war was not driven by conquest. It was driven by preservation. Shinobi fought not to expand territory, but to prevent annihilation. The Senju ideal, once limited to a single village, had expanded to shape the conduct of an entire world. The legacy manifested in quiet moments. Medics risking their lives to retrieve the wounded. Commanders choosing retreat over pointless loss. Soldiers shielding comrades they had met only days before. These choices were not accidental. They were the product of generations raised under systems the Senju had created. As ancient forces re-emerged, Madara Uchiha revived through forbidden techniques, the ideological conflict at the heart of the war became undeniable. Madara represented a philosophy unchanged by time. He believed peace could only be enforced through absolute power, that free will inevitably led to conflict. Naruto stood in direct opposition. Where Madara sought control, Naruto sought connection. Where Madara embraced despair, Naruto rejected inevitability. Their clash echoed the final battle between Hashirama and Madara, not just in scale, but in meaning. Once again, The fate of the world hinged not on strength alone, but on belief. The revival of the Ten Tails pushed the conflict toward catastrophe. As chaos spread and hope began to falter, Naruto reached beyond traditional boundaries. He connected with the tailed beasts, not as tools, but as individuals shaped by centuries of suffering. This act alone challenged everything the shinobi world had accepted as normal. It was the Senju dream realized in its purest form, not peace enforced through fear, but peace pursued through understanding. Even as Tsunade herself was gravely wounded, her resolve did not break. She continued to coordinate medical efforts, refusing to abandon the injured even as the battlefield crumbled around her. In those moments, she embodied every sacrifice the Senju had ever made. The war pressed onward, and with each passing moment, it became clearer that this conflict was not merely about survival, but about whether the ideals born in the Warring States era could finally bring closure to a cycle thousands of years old. The answer had not yet been decided, but for the first time in history, it was within reach. As the Fourth Great Ninja War deepened, the conflict transformed from a struggle for survival into a reckoning with history itself. What unfolded across the battlefield was not merely a clash of shinobi, but the collision of philosophies that had been forming since the earliest days of the Warring States era. The Senju Clan, though long dissolved as a visible force, stood at the heart of this confrontation through the ideals they had left behind. The war stripped away illusions. Villages that had once believed themselves prepared found their systems strained to the breaking point. Communication faltered. Supply lines were severed. Entire divisions faced annihilation in moments. Yet, even as chaos spread, something unexpected emerged. Cooperation that transcended fear. Shinobi fought not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to protect one another. This was the Senju influence made tangible. The battlefield became a living reflection of Hashirama's dream. Imperfect, yet undeniable. Former enemies shielded each other from harm. Medical units worked without regard for national origin. The village-first mentality expanded into something greater, a world-first mentality, born from necessity, but sustained by shared humanity. Naruto Uzumaki moved through this chaos as a unifying presence. His arrival on the battlefield shifted momentum not simply through strength, but through belief. Soldiers who had lost hope found themselves fighting again, not out of obligation, but inspiration. Naruto did not command loyalty. He earned it by standing alongside those he protected, sharing their burden rather than rising above it. This was the Senju ideal embodied fully. Naruto refused to see the war as a contest of power. To him, every opponent was a person shaped by pain. Every enemy carried a story. This perspective allowed him to reach others where force could not. Even the tailed beasts felt this change. Long treated as weapons, they responded to Naruto not with fear, but recognition. For the first time, their existence was acknowledged as more than tools of destruction. This shift challenged centuries of shinobi tradition and validated Hashirama's belief that true peace required understanding all forms of life. But the war's greatest challenge had yet to reveal itself. Madara Uchiha stood as a living reminder of what the world might become if fear dictated its future. His power was overwhelming, his presence reshaping the battlefield with casual dominance. Yet his greatest weapon was not strength, it was certainty. Madara believed he was right. He believed the world was incapable of peace without control. That suffering was inevitable. That free will would always lead to war. His vision offered an escape from pain, but only through the erasure of choice. The Senju had always rejected this path. Hashirama had believed peace must be chosen, even if it was fragile. Tobirama had believed systems could guide that choice. Tsunade had believed life itself must be protected above all else. Naruto carried all three beliefs within him. Their confrontation was inevitable. As Madara pressed forward, unveiling the true scope of his ambition, the war reached a turning point. The Ten Tails' power threatened to overwhelm everything the allied shinobi forces had built. Hope faltered as casualties mounted and exhaustion took hold. In this moment, the Senju legacy was tested more brutally than ever before. Could ideals endure when the cost was everything? Naruto answered not with certainty, but with resolve. He refused to abandon those who had fallen into despair. He spoke to shinobi, who had lost family, villages, and purpose. He did not promise an end to pain. He promised that pain would not be meaningless, that it could be transformed into connection rather than hatred. This belief spread quietly, not through speeches, but through action. Naruto shielded allies from impossible attacks. He shared chakra freely, sustaining those on the brink of collapse. In doing so, he demonstrated a form of leadership that did not rely on authority, but trust. The battlefield responded. Even as Madara's power escalated, the alliance held. The war no longer belonged solely to generals or legends. It belonged to everyone fighting within it. Each shinobi became a carrier of the Senju ideal, whether they realized it or not. Tsunade, still bearing the wounds of battle, continued to coordinate relief efforts. Her refusal to yield mirrored the stubborn resilience of her clan. Though her body faltered, her presence steadied the village's heart. She had once believed the Senju dream was naive. Now she saw it carried forward by countless hands. As the war neared its climax, the true enemy revealed itself. Not merely Madara, but the ancient cycle of resentment he represented. The war was no longer about victory. It was about closure. Naruto confronted this truth directly. He recognized that defeating Madara alone would not end the cycle. Hatred would simply take another form. The Senju dream demanded something more difficult. Reconciliation without erasure, peace without illusion. This understanding placed Naruto on a path no shinobi had walked before. He became not just a soldier, but a bridge between eras. Between the past, shaped by endless war, and a future struggling to be born. In him, the ideals of the Senju were no longer theoretical. They were alive, evolving, and responsive to the world as it was. The war pressed forward, relentlessly. Yet beneath the devastation, something irreversible had occurred. The shinobi world had glimpsed a different way forward. Not a perfect one, not an easy one, but one rooted in choice rather than control. And as the final battles loomed, it became clear that the Senju clan's greatest achievement was not the village they founded, nor the wars they ended. It was the belief they passed on, a belief now strong enough to challenge the very fate of the world. As the fourth Great Ninja War continued to unfold, it became increasingly clear that the conflict had moved far beyond the limits of conventional battle. What once resembled a war between nations had transformed into something deeper and more abstract, a confrontation shaped by centuries of accumulated grief, fear, and unresolved belief. The battlefield itself seemed to reflect this shift, no longer defined by borders or formations, but by the emotional weight carried by those who stood upon it. For generations, the Senju clan had believed that peace could be built within the real world, imperfect and painful as it was. They rejected the notion that suffering could simply be erased, insisting instead that it must be faced, understood, and shared. Now, as the war reached its most volatile stage, that belief stood in direct opposition to the path Madara Uchiha sought to impose upon the world. Madara did not see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as a savior. To him, the endless repetition of war was proof that humanity was incapable of change. Every era had followed the same pattern, hope rising briefly before collapsing under resentment and loss. In his eyes, free will itself was the flaw. The infinite Tsukuyomi represented escape, not conquest. A dream without suffering, a world where no one would ever need to endure loss again. Naruto Uzumaki listened to this vision carefully. He did not mock it. He did not dismiss it as madness. Instead, he recognized the loneliness at its core. Madara's certainty was not born from arrogance, but exhaustion. He had lived through too much loss to believe in gradual change. To him, control felt kinder than chaos. But Naruto could not accept a peace built on abandonment of reality. The Senju clan had always believed that pain, while unbearable at times, was also what gave bonds their meaning. Hashirama had once accepted that peace would never be perfect, but believed it was worth pursuing precisely because it required effort and sacrifice. Naruto carried this belief forward instinctively, shaped by a life defined by rejection and perseverance. As the Ten Tails' power spread across the battlefield, the scale of destruction threatened to overwhelm even the most resilient shinobi. Entire landscapes were reshaped in moments. Chakra saturated the air so densely it became difficult to distinguish one presence from another. And yet, amid this overwhelming force, Naruto chose to act not as a weapon, but as a conduit. Rather than hoarding power, Naruto shared it. He distributed his chakra to allies across the battlefield, reinforcing them not only physically, but emotionally. In that moment, strength became communal rather than hierarchical. Shinobi, who had reached the limits of exhaustion, found themselves standing again, not because they had been ordered to, but because they felt supported. This act embodied the final evolution of the Senju ideal. Strength was no longer something inherited, seized, or enforced. It was something given freely, sustained through trust. The battlefield responded to this shift almost immediately, not through sudden victory, but through endurance. The alliance held where it should have collapsed. Even the tailed beasts, long treated as instruments of fear, responded differently. Through Naruto, they were acknowledged as beings shaped by centuries of confinement and misunderstanding. For the first time, their power was not extracted through force, but offered through cooperation. This alone challenged one of the oldest foundations of the shinobi world, validating the Senju belief that respect could succeed where domination had failed. As Madara's plans unraveled and Obito's role was laid bare, another layer of the war revealed itself. Obito was not defeated through overwhelming power. He was reached through recognition. Naruto confronted him not as an enemy, but as a reflection of what could have happened had he himself surrendered to bitterness. Their exchange unfolded slowly, painfully, as years of grief surfaced and were finally acknowledged. Obito's eventual surrender did not feel like triumph. It felt like release. This moment rippled across the battlefield, weakening the ideological foundation of Madara's vision. If someone as deeply lost as Obito could choose connection again, then the cycle was not as immutable as Madara believed. And yet, the war continued to escalate. Kaguya's emergence shattered any remaining sense of familiarity. The conflict transcended history, village, and ideology, becoming something ancient and vast. Space itself distorted, pulling the shinobi world into a confrontation beyond comprehension. In these moments, control became an illusion entirely. Still, the Senju legacy endured. Naruto and Sasuke fought together, their cooperation reflecting the balance Hashirama had once dreamed of but never fully achieved. Power and restraint, ambition and empathy. Their shared struggle carried the weight of generations, echoing the final battle at the Valley of the End, while offering the possibility of a different outcome. Throughout this chaos, Tsunade's influence remained quietly present. Though removed from the center of battle, her reforms saved countless lives. Medical units operated under impossible conditions, guided by her belief that survival itself was an act of defiance against despair. Every life preserved was a testament to the Senju conviction that no sacrifice should be made lightly. As the war approached its final phase, exhaustion settled over the world. Not the sharp fatigue of defeat, but the deep weariness of those who had given everything and still stood. In that exhaustion, clarity emerged. Victory alone would not be enough. Without reconciliation, the cycle would simply begin again under a different name. Naruto understood this instinctively. He recognized that the true conclusion of the war would not be marked by Madara's fall or Kaguya's defeat, but by the choice made afterward. The final conflict was approaching, not between nations, but between two paths shaped by the same pain. Once again, Naruto prepared to face Sasuke, not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a bond that refused to be severed. This belief, that connection could survive even betrayal, was the final inheritance of the Senju Clan. A belief tested across generations, now resting in the hands of a single shinobi willing to carry it forward. The world waited, and through Naruto, the Senju dream remained alive. When the fourth great ninja war finally receded, it did not leave behind triumph or celebration. Instead, it left silence, a vast, weighty silence that stretched across the lands like a held breath, as though the world itself was uncertain whether it was truly allowed to rest. The battlefield no longer trembled with chakra or echoed with cries, yet the absence of sound carried its own gravity. For those who had survived, peace did not arrive as relief, but as something unfamiliar, something that needed to be carefully approached rather than embraced all at once. This was the moment the Senju clan had always been preparing for, even if they had never known it. For generations, the Senju had believed that the end of war would not be marked by victory, but by what followed afterward. Hashirama had understood this intuitively. He knew that peace was not an event, but a responsibility. Tobirama had attempted to preserve it through structure. Tsunade had protected it through preservation of life. And now, in the quiet aftermath of the war, the final question surfaced. What would the world do when there was no enemy left to unite against? Naruto Uzumaki felt this question deeply, even before it was spoken. Though the war had ended, Naruto did not feel complete. The bonds forged on the battlefield were real, but fragile. History had shown time and again that unity born from shared danger faded once fear receded. Naruto understood that if something fundamental did not change, the cycle would simply resume under a different name. The hatred that had shaped the shinobi world for centuries had not been erased. It had merely been paused. And at the center of that unresolved tension stood Sasuke Uchiha. Their separation from the rest of the world was not accidental. Just as Hashirama and Madara had once been drawn away from their comrades, Naruto and Sasuke found themselves isolated, standing at the threshold between what the world had been and what it might become. The land around them felt heavy with memory, echoing with the remnants of every battle that had come before. This confrontation was not about dominance. It was about direction. Sasuke carried the weight of history differently than Naruto. Where Naruto had grown stronger through bonds, Sasuke had grown sharper through loss. To him, the war had confirmed what he had always believed, that the shinobi world was incapable of change without force. He did not reject peace. He rejected fragility. He believed that someone had to bear the world's hatred alone, to become a singular point of darkness so that others could live without it. This belief was not born from cruelty. It was born from exhaustion. Sasuke had watched clans vanish, families collapse, and systems fail. He had seen how ideals crumbled when tested by reality. To him, Naruto's faith in connection felt dangerously optimistic, as though it ignored the depth of suffering that had shaped the world. Naruto did not interrupt him. He listened, just as Hashirama had once listened to Madara. Naruto allowed Sasuke's pain to exist without denial. He did not attempt to argue it away. Instead, he acknowledged it fully, because Naruto understood something the Senju had always believed. Pain that is ignored becomes hatred, but pain that is shared can soften. Naruto spoke not as a hero, but as someone who had lived inside loneliness for most of his life. He spoke of isolation that gnawed quietly, of being surrounded by people yet never truly seen. He spoke of anger that tempted him daily, of how easy it would have been to surrender to resentment. And he spoke of how bonds, once formed, had changed him irrevocably. This was not persuasion. It was recognition. The battle between them unfolded slowly, with long pauses between exchanges, as though both were reluctant to finish something that had defined their lives for so long. Each movement carried hesitation, memory, and restraint. This was not a fight to prove superiority, but a collision between two visions of peace shaped by the same suffering. As their strength diminished, certainty eroded. Exhaustion stripped away conviction until only intention remained. Sasuke's resolve, once rigid and unyielding, began to waver, not because Naruto overpowered him, but because Naruto refused to abandon him. Even as the battle drained them both, Naruto continued to insist that hatred did not have to be carried alone. This insistence echoed the Senju dream more clearly than ever before. Hashirama had believed that peace required vulnerability. Tobirama had feared that vulnerability invited collapse. Tsunade had learned that vulnerability was unavoidable. Naruto accepted all of it and chose connection anyway. When the battle ended, it did not end with victory. It ended with stillness. Both lay broken, stripped of strength and illusion, unable to continue even if they wanted to. In that stillness, the truth surfaced quietly. The cycle that had begun generations earlier had not been shattered by force, but by refusal. Naruto refused to let the world repeat itself, even if it meant carrying pain forward instead of discarding it. Sasuke, finally unable to deny this, let go. Not of his past, but of the belief that isolation was the only solution. In that moment, the conflict between Senju and Uchiha ideology reached its conclusion, not through dominance, not through erasure, but through acceptance. The dream Hashirama had failed to complete found resolution, not in his lifetime, but through someone who inherited his belief without his power. As they were brought back to the village, the world began to move again. Nations withdrew cautiously. Shinobi returned home, carrying scars that would never fully fade. The alliance dissolved without hostility, replaced by something quieter: memory. The knowledge that cooperation, once achieved, could be achieved again. Tsunade watched this transition with a stillness shaped by long experience. She had once abandoned the Senju dream because it hurt too much to believe in it. Now, she saw it fulfilled not through perfection, but through persistence. The will of fire had survived not because it was invincible, but because it had been carried forward by those willing to endure its cost. The Senju Clan no longer needed to exist as a name. Their purpose had been completed. They had planted an idea strong enough to survive beyond bloodlines, beyond villages, beyond war itself. And for the first time in history, the shinobi world stood without a looming shadow from its past after the final battle ended and the world began to move again. It did not do so quickly. Change, when it arrives after centuries of repetition, rarely announces itself with certainty. Instead, it arrives quietly, almost hesitantly, testing whether it is truly welcome. The shinobi world entered a period of stillness unlike anything it had known before, a calm not enforced by fear or maintained through vigilance, but sustained through exhaustion and reflection. Villages rebuilt slowly, not because they lacked the ability to rebuild faster, but because there was no longer a need to rush toward the next conflict. The urgency that had once defined shinobi life softened. Missions became fewer. Borders remained guarded, but no longer bristled with expectation. For the first time since the founding of the villages, the world was not bracing itself for the next war. This was the space the Senju Clan had always imagined, a space where strength could rest, a space where children were not raised with inevitability, carved into their futures. Konoha itself felt different. The village still carried scars, some visible in damaged stone and rebuilt districts, others hidden in memory and silence. But there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted. Conversations changed. The language of enemies faded, replaced by cautious acknowledgement. Even grief, though still present, felt less isolated, shared openly rather than buried beneath duty. Tsunade remained Hokage during this fragile transition. She governed not as a symbol of power, but as a steward of recovery. Her leadership during this period reflected the fullest expression of the Senju legacy, not in grand decisions or dramatic reforms, but in patience. She resisted pressure to expand influence or assert dominance. Instead, she focused on healing, both physical and emotional, allowing the village to relearn what peace felt like. Medical infrastructure expanded further, not for war, but for longevity. Hospitals became places of community rather than emergency. Training shifted away from pure combat and toward balance. Shinobi were encouraged to specialize, to explore roles beyond the battlefield. The idea that one's value was defined solely by combat ability began to loosen its grip. This change did not happen all at once. Some resisted it. There were those who had built their entire identities around conflict, who felt unmoored, without an enemy to measure themselves against. Tsunade understood this better than anyone. She did not force transition. She allowed time to do what authority could not. Naruto Uzumaki moved through this new world quietly. Though recognized as a hero, he did not seek attention. The weight of what he had done and what he had prevented settled over him gradually. For the first time in his life, he was not defined by struggle. The absence of constant conflict left him with space to reflect. And in that space, he matured. Naruto began to understand leadership not as aspiration, but as responsibility. He assisted in rebuilding efforts, not because it was expected, but because he wanted to remain connected to the people he had fought to protect. He listened more than he spoke. He learned to sit with silence rather than fill it. The impulsive certainty of his youth softened into something steadier, grounded by experience. This maturation was not dramatic. It was subtle. It showed in restraint, in patience, in the way he began to consider consequences beyond himself. The boy who once demanded recognition now understood that true leadership often required invisibility. In this way, Naruto embodied the final evolution of the Senju ideal. Hashirama had dreamed of peace. Tobirama had structured it. Tsunade had preserved it. Naruto learned to live within it. The village began to look to him naturally, not because he demanded authority, but because people trusted him. Shinobi sought his counsel. Children listened when he spoke. Elders observed his growth with quiet approval. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no declaration. Leadership simply gathered around him. The Senju Clan's influence could be felt in every aspect of this transition. The Hokage system remained, but its meaning had changed. No longer was it merely the strongest shinobi or the greatest tactician who was expected to lead. Now, leadership required emotional endurance, the ability to carry the pain of others without being consumed by it. This expectation traced directly back to Hashirama's belief. Peace was not something won. It was something maintained. Naruto's relationship with Sasuke settled into something quieter. Not resolution, but understanding. They did not pretend the past no longer existed. They allowed it to remain, acknowledged without dominance. Their bond, once defined by rivalry and desperation, became something steadier, an unspoken agreement to remain present in a world they had both nearly lost. Beyond Konoha, the shinobi world adjusted cautiously. Alliances held. Communication between villages increased. Small conflicts arose, but were resolved through negotiation rather than escalation. The presence of Naruto, known across nations not as a conqueror, but as a mediator, discouraged reckless ambition. This was something new. For the first time, power itself acted as a stabilizing force without being imposed. The Senju dream had reached maturity. No longer fragile, no longer idealistic, no longer dependent on singular figures. It existed as a shared understanding that peace was difficult, imperfect, and worth sustaining precisely because of those flaws. Tsunade began to prepare quietly for transition. She did not announce retirement, but she recognized when her role was nearing completion. She had guided the village through loss, war, and recovery. Now, the future required a different kind of endurance, one shaped by long horizons rather than immediate threats. Naruto did not yet realize what awaited him, but the path had already formed beneath his feet. The village was ready. The world was ready. And the ideals planted by the Senju Clan centuries earlier had finally found the environment they needed to endure. The final chapter was approaching. Time continued forward in Konoha without ceremony, just as it always had, marked not by grand announcements or dramatic shifts, but by small, almost unnoticeable changes that accumulated until the village no longer resembled the one that had existed before the war. Buildings were repaired, paths smoothed, trees replanted where scars had once been left exposed. Children laughed more freely. The sound of training fields no longer carried the weight of preparation for inevitable loss, but the lighter rhythm of growth and discipline balanced by expectation of a future. This quiet transformation was the truest sign that the Senju clan's purpose had been fulfilled. For generations, the Senju had existed in opposition to fear. They had lived in an era where survival required constant readiness, where peace was temporary and suspicion permanent. Hashirama had dared to imagine something different, even when the world was not ready to accept it. Tobirama had shaped that dream into systems strong enough to endure distrust. Tsunade had held it together through grief, war, and exhaustion. And now, without realizing it, Naruto Uzumaki was living inside the dream itself. The transition of leadership did not arrive as a moment of urgency. It arrived as inevitability. Tsunade's presence in the Hokage's office became less frequent, her guidance quieter, more advisory than directive. She watched as Naruto naturally took on responsibility, mediating disputes, encouraging cooperation, and reminding others, sometimes without words, that strength was no longer measured by domination, but by restraint. She recognized this evolution with a calm acceptance shaped by long experience. When the time finally came, it felt less like an appointment and more like acknowledgement. The village gathered, not in tension, but in warmth. Faces filled the square, shinobi who had fought in wars, elders who remembered past Hokage, children who had never known conflict beyond stories. The atmosphere carried reverence, but not fear. Hope was no longer fragile enough to be treated cautiously. Naruto stood before them, not as the boy who once demanded recognition, nor even as the hero who had saved the world, but as someone who had grown alongside the village itself. His presence did not command silence through authority. It invited it through trust. As he accepted the title of Hokage, the moment echoed backward through time. Hashirama Senju, standing at the village's founding, offering his dream to a world that doubted him. Tobirama, ensuring that dream would not collapse under its own vulnerability. Tsunade, returning to leadership when the dream was closest to shattering, refusing to let it die, even when it hurt to believe in it. Naruto inherited all of it, not as burden, but as continuity. The Hokage cloak rested on his shoulders without resistance. It did not weigh him down. It fit naturally, as though the role had been waiting for him to grow into it, rather than forcing him to become something he was not. In that moment, the Senju legacy stopped being history and became environment, something lived rather than remembered. Naruto governed differently. He did not rule through fear, nor did he rely on legend. He led through presence. He remained accessible, visible, human. He listened. He laughed. He acknowledged mistakes openly. In doing so, he dissolved the distance that had once existed between leader and village. This was something the Senju had always believed possible, but had never fully realized. Leadership without isolation, peace without stagnation, strength without cruelty. Under Naruto's guidance, the shinobi world continued to evolve. Missions emphasized protection over domination. Alliances deepened into genuine cooperation. The idea of inherited hatred lost its power as new generations grew up without the same scars their parents carried. The Uchiha and Senju conflict, once the axis around which the world revolved, faded into history. Not forgotten, but understood. Its lessons remained, but its grip loosened. Sasuke walked his own path during this time, not as an exile, but as a guardian, moving quietly through the margins of the world. His existence no longer represented opposition. Instead, it served as reminder of what the world had been and what it chose not to return to. Naruto never tried to pull him back into the village, though permanently. Trust did not require possession. This understanding marked the final evolution of the Senju ideal. Hashirama had dreamed of unity. Naruto accepted plurality. The world no longer needed a single vision to impose peace. It needed shared responsibility, mutual recognition, and the courage to choose understanding repeatedly, even when it was difficult. As years passed, the Senju name became less prominent, not because it was erased, but because it was no longer necessary to invoke it. Its principles had woven themselves so deeply into the fabric of the world that they no longer required attribution. Villages functioned without constant fear. Shinobi found meaning beyond battle. Children dreamed of futures shaped by choice rather than inevitability. This was the truest success the Senju Clan could have achieved: to create a world where they were no longer needed as symbols. Naruto, standing atop the Hokage monument years later, looked out over the village with quiet contentment. The faces carved into stone behind him were reminders, not burdens. He did not feel pressure to live up to them. He felt gratitude for the path they had cleared. The wind moved gently through the village below, carrying ordinary sounds: conversation, footsteps, laughter. These sounds, once fragile, now felt enduring. The long night of conflict had ended. Not because the world became perfect, but because it finally learned how to rest. And with that, the story of the Senju Clan came to its natural close. Not in extinction, but in fulfillment. Their legacy living on in a world that no longer needed to fight to prove it deserved peace.